Embattled Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and we're going to get into all of it. In just a moment, I'm going to play you an incredibly newsworthy and incredibly alarming interview I did today with Congressman Jim Himes. Jim Himes, of course, is the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, who was one of the very few people in the room today during a classified briefing on the unfolding scandal that has absolutely engulfed the Trump administration. That is, of course, the September 2nd operation to take out a suspected Venezuelan drug boat and the decision to launch a second strike to kill its shipwrecked survivors, an action that appears to almost exactly fit the textbook definition of a war crime. Now, Congressman Himes was one of, again, only a handful of lawmakers authorized to attend that meeting today. So only a few people have access to the information he has access to, where for the very first time, they were able to watch the full unedited video of that strike. And also, of course, question Admiral Frank Bradley, who's the Navy commander who oversaw that operation. Now, the headlines out of that meeting so far today have mostly covered the news that Bradley said he did not get a reported order from Secretary Hegseth to kill everyone on the boat and leave no survivors. And that is certainly significant news. And in my interview with Congressman Himes, you're going to hear what he says when I ask him more about that. But what took place in that closed-door meeting wasn't exactly in any way reassuring to the lawmakers who were there. And frankly, I knew I had to talk to Congressman Himes after I saw him say this about what he saw and heard in that room today.
What I saw in that room was one of the most troubling things I've seen in my time in public service. You have two individuals in clear distress, without any means of locomotion, with a destroyed vessel, who were killed by the United States.
Now, I think I know why he had that reaction, because based on what Congressman Himes told me today, there's reason to doubt a number of things we've heard from Trump officials and anonymous administration sources that have been the basis of a number of stories out there about that strike. And I'm going to show you that interview in a second, I promise. Again, it's newsworthy. There's lots of details in there. He says things that have not been said publicly to this point. But first, I want to just give you some important context, because there's a lot of details in this whole story to cover and follow. It was a big part of any possible justification for that second strike seems to hinge on this idea that the survivors clinging to the wreckage of that boat were communicating with their cohorts by radio in an effort to resume their alleged drug smuggling. Now, as the Wall Street Journal reported just last night, Admiral Bradley planned to tell lawmakers that he, quote, concluded the two survivors were attempting to continue their drug run, end quote, in making his decision, considered that survivors were believed to be communicating via radio with others in the drug smuggling network. That's a very key detail there. And that's according to two defense officials. Now, obviously, the reported use of a radio or a communications device and the potential to use it to communicate with anyone from a drug smuggling ring is pretty central to the Pentagon's attempt to defend the indefensible. And clearly, some people at the Pentagon wanted that information out very, very badly, because versions of that story have been reported now by multiple outlets. I mean, here's ABC News. The survivors were believed to be potentially in communication with other boats in the vicinity. And that was one reason why, quote, the two survivors were determined to be still in the fight and considered to be valid targets, all per a source familiar with the incident. Likewise, here's the Washington Post, quote, U.S. personnel believed the survivors possessed communications equipment and may have been capable of calling other drug smugglers, per someone familiar with what Admiral Bradley planned to tell lawmakers today. And here's the New York Times, quote, the U.S. military intercepted radio communications from one of the survivors to what a U.S. official said were narco traffickers. And here's NBC News, quote, the two survivors were in electronic communication with another ship suspected of being involved in narcotics trafficking. That's according to two people with knowledge of the matter. Now, point of all of that is clearly someone at the Pentagon wanted this story about radio communications out there to justify this strike. But you're going to hear Jim Himes tell me in just a few seconds that today's briefing made clear that story is simply not true. And there are other parts of the official story that this meeting calls into question. I mean, from the outset, Pete Hegseth and other administration officials had done everything possible to place the ownership of the decision to launch that second strike on Admiral Bradley. On Monday, Hegseth posted that he stands by, quote, the combat decisions he has made from that September 2nd mission. Now, note how he pins the decision to kill those survivors on Admiral Bradley there. That's been pretty consistent. Hegseth has also suggested he was not privy to the details of the operation as it unfolded in the time leading up to that second strike. After all, he had already left the room. That's what he said.
So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. A couple of hours later, I learned that that commander had made which he had the complete authority to do. And by the way, Admiral Bradley made the correct decision to ultimately sink the boat and eliminate the threat. He sunk the boat, and eliminated the threat.
Again, see, he's pinning it on Admiral Bradley there. Well, Trump seems to be maybe catching from shut eye next to him. But that aside, Hegseth said he only learned of the Admiral's decision a couple hours after he left the room. Well, in the interview you're about to see, you're going to hear what Congressman Himes asked Admiral Bradley about Hegseth's involvement and awareness of that second strike. Which brings me to the very last bit of important context you need before I show you this interview. Because we've already seen how Secretary Hegseth has tried so hard to distance himself from this strike any way that he can. First by pinning sole responsibility for what happened on Admiral Bradley repeatedly, then by revealing he, quote, didn't stick around to see the rest of the mission. And then by offering this absurd defense when he was asked to confirm that he didn't see the shipwreck survivors after the first strike.
So you didn't see any survivors, to be clear, after that first strike?
I did not personally see survivors, but I stand, because the thing was on fire. It was exploded and fire is smoke. You can't see anything. You got digital. This is called the fog of war. This is what you in the press don't understand.
I think a lot of people in the press do understand. I mean, the fog of war is a phrase that's commonly used to refer to the confusion caused by the chaos of a war or a battle. But it does sort of make you wonder if Secretary Hegseth thinks the phrase refers to literal fog. Well, whatever confusion Pete Hegseth may have been experiencing personally about that phrase, and it seems like he had some, what Congressman Himes describes to me is considerably different from what you just heard Hegseth say there. Okay, buckle up, everyone. Here we go. Joining me now is Congressman Jim Himes. He's the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, and he was inside that classified briefing today. Congressman, thank you so much for being here with me. You said earlier today that what you saw in that room was the most disturbing thing you've seen during your time in public service, which is quite a thing to say. I mean, that comment definitely sent a chill down my spine. I'm sure a lot of people who heard it. Tell us why you were so disturbed.
Yeah, Jen, and I mean, I'll give you some context here. You know, in virtue of my role on the Intelligence Committee, you know, these sorts of videos in other contexts are not foreign to me. So, you know, I'm not pearl clutching over something I haven't seen before. But what I saw in that video, and I'm hoping that the American people will have an opportunity to see it and judge for themselves, were two individuals whose boat had been incinerated and capsized, clinging for life without any visible means of survival or support, and then they were killed. You know, it raises profound moral and ethical issues that anybody who watches this video should have. But it also points to something that is super clear in the laws of armed conflict and in the Pentagon's regulations around that, which is that once an individual has been placed out of any ability to conduct hostilities, to attack you, the technical phrase is hors de combat, once an individual can't attack you, you can't kill that individual. And there's a complicated argument made that, you know, well, this individual might have been picked up by his buddies and, you know, maybe they would have saved some cocaine. Maybe. No evidence that would have happened, and it certainly wasn't happening. So there's just no way to get away from the fact that the United States killed two individuals who were shipwrecked and in massive distress. And, you know, I will leave it to the lawyers to determine the precise elements of the legality of that. But anybody who sees that video would have real questions about whether the United States is abiding by the values that distinguish us around the world.
It's no question about it, and it's so important that the United States abides by those values. There's been so much public reporting that has been conflicting. One of the reasons it's so helpful to talk to you is to help maybe provide some clarity to the degree you can. Secretary Hegseth said this week he didn't personally see the survivors in the video. He said the boat exploded in fire and smoke, and that you really couldn't see anything. He said it's called the fog of war. It doesn't sound like that's what you described, but what do you make of that characterization now that you've seen the video?
Yeah, well, again, a little bit of context here. You know, about a week after this strike, the Congress was briefed on this strike, and the question was raised: why did you go after the survivors? Why was there more strikes taken? And the answer was because we wanted to clear the sea for safety of navigation. I asked the admiral why the story was totally different now, and he had no answer. And by the way, I don't blame the admiral for not having that answer, because clearly this is a Pentagon in utter disarray. What Pete Hegseth said with respect to the fog of war is simply inaccurate. And by the way, Pete Hegseth, of course, given the report that came out today, is hardly a credible source. But I watched the video, and yes, of course, clouds went by, but this went on for a period of many hours. And we were therefore able to very closely observe these individuals for a lengthy period of time. And so, no, this was not a fog of war issue. Again, the argument is made, and the argument was made, that would not stand up to the machine gunning of U.S. sailors by Japanese naval forces in World War II, which is, my gosh, they might have actually been able someday to complete their mission. They might have called for help and gotten picked up. This feels to me like an analogous case. And just because they're bad guys, and I suspect they probably were, although I suspect they were probably out-of-work fishermen who took $400 to run a boat up to Trinidad, just because they were bad guys, just because they might have gone back into the fight, none of that gives you defense against the legal obligation in the laws of war not to attack them, and in fact, under maritime law, to render assistance. Under maritime law, a vessel in the area must render assistance to distressed mariners. Instead, we killed them.
These are literally definitions in the playbook, to your point, and all of the rules of engagement that the military is supposed to abide by. The other piece that's been a little bit confusing out there is that Secretary Hegseth also said this week that he wasn't in the room for the second strike on the survivors. I'm not suggesting you saw that in the video or not, but is that something you spoke with Admiral Bradley about, or did he say anything about that?
I did, and the answer I got first, and we should be clear on this, the Secretary apparently, according to the Admiral, gave no kill them all order, and that there was no order given to do what apparently we did, which was to give no quarter. Secondly, the Admiral told me that the Secretary was not in the room when the Admiral gave the order. I then asked whether he was aware or party to the conversations, because I think there was a lot of consultation over a lengthy period of time about next steps, and he said he did not know the answer to that question.
So he was not in the room, it sounds like, according to the Admiral. I know you said earlier today, and you just, again, reiterated, of course, that Admiral Bradley told you that there had not been a kill them all order. That obviously contradicts the original Washington Post reporting about what Hegseth ordered, and there's contradictory reporting out there. How should we understand, tell me a little bit more about this, how should we understand what that means about who ordered what and when, and kind of what the remaining questions you have about that are?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason that's important is because any order that said kill them all, or to, in the parlance of the military, to deny quarter, which basically means that if somebody is not in the fight, you capture them, you don't kill them. Had that order been given, that would have very clearly been an illegal order. And according to the Admiral, that order was not given. So if you want to get into, precisely who was in command when and who had weapons release authority and all of these rather esoteric elements, which we should get into, that would be a lengthy conversation. But the important thing here is that the military has a long tradition, and anybody who has been in the military will confirm this, that responsibility cannot be delegated. by senior leaders, that you can delegate authority, but you cannot delegate responsibility. So when we see Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump doing a little soft shoe about how we stand with the admiral, it was the admiral's decision, you see something happening which is completely inconsistent with the military culture that would have the Secretary of Defense man up and say, in the tradition of the United States Navy and the United States Armed Forces, I take responsibility for these actions. That's the way the military has always operated, and that is not what you saw the other day.
It is. I worked for 2 presidents with 2 national security teams. I've never seen anything quite like this. And of course, you've though been in the briefing in the room. I want to ask you about something you also just talked about. The Wall Street Journal, because the Wall Street Journal reported last night that Admiral Bradley concluded the 2 survivors were attempting to continue their drug run, and that those survivors were believed to be communicating via radio with others in the drug smuggling ecosystem. It sounds like you're a bit skeptical of that, but I want you to speak to it. Is that something you discussed? It sounds like you discussed it today, but how did you discuss it? Is there evidence they were radioing, or is the radio something you're trying to get access to?
Well, I don't want to get specific here, but there was no radio. There were 2 individuals clinging to flotsam. That's what there was. There wasn't weaponry of any kind. There wasn't a radio. There was no means for them to communicate other than the fact that the fire and the smoke was fairly well visible for a long distance around, but there was no radio.
That's a pretty important detail, that there was no radio, given that seems to be an implication in some of the reporting about the justification. Let me ask you, there seems to be more questions. I think more questions you have, more questions people out there have. Do you think Pete Hegseth needs to testify publicly about this? Would you like to see that happen?
I think it's really important. Most importantly, people need to see the video because, I live in a political world, and a lot of folks, if you just tell them, the president is killing narco-terrorists in the Caribbean, reasonably enough, they'll say, a lot of Americans die because of overdoses, and, they might say, okay, I'm supportive of that, right? But what you need to do is you need to see 2 terrified men clinging to the wreckage of a ship. And these men are not, this is not Pablo Escobar out there on a boat. These are guys that probably didn't have a lot of economic opportunity, made a terrible decision to participate in the drug trade. America needs to see 2 clearly distressed, shipwrecked individuals, probably fearing that they will be dead very soon, and in fact becoming dead very soon, because the United States looked at those 2 and said, we are going to use the full force of the United States military to end these 2 lives, rather than rendering assistance, rather than capturing them. America needs to see what it means to be doing what we're doing in the Caribbean. So I hope that that video is made public to people. And yes, I do hope that the Secretary of Defense will explain not just this incident, but why shifting, because this is what we're doing, right? Shifting cocaine routes from the maritime routes of the Caribbean to air routes and to terrestrial routes through Central America should occupy some massive percentage of American naval combat power and result in the deaths of dozens and dozens of people.
I certainly hope. I know you're going to keep pressing. Others will keep pressing for that video. It sounds like something American public absolutely should be able to see. Congressman Jim Himes, thank you so much for making the time today.
Thank you, Jen.
Coming up, there was another massive embarrassment for the Trump Justice Department today, believe it or not, as they tried again and failed again to indict New York Attorney Letitia James. I'm going to get Congressman Dan Goldman's reaction to that in just a few minutes, but first, no amount of press restrictions, and this is a good thing, from Pete Hegseth could stop the Signalgate scandal from exploding into public view. And today, we learned even more. Barbara Starr is a legendary former Pentagon correspondent. Marty Barron is the legendary former executive editor of The Washington Post. I have a million questions for both of them, and they're going to join me here next.